Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, depending on. I'd like to welcome you all to the fourth and final webinar in IPCIDE's webinar series on the ethics and governance of AI. Through this series, before the India AI Impact Summit, we aim to advance critical conversations on AI governance and ethics and ensure that responsible innovation also sees a spotlight as India prepares to host the first Impact Summit in the Global South that the world has seen. So in this webinar series, we invite leading experts from all across the globe to share with us their research and their perspectives, and then also invite distinguished Indian discussants to talk about and sort of bounce ideas off of that research, and then we can on the themes in national and global contexts. We aim to encourage conversations and exchanges of ideas on these topics because AI truly is something that's looking to technology, actually, and technology and law and policy is something that generally transcends boundaries. And we want to take that into account while we go and see and ensure that responsible innovation does remain at the forefront of India's AI involving landscape. So for today's webinar, the title is From Digital Sovereignty to AI Sovereignty, Lessons from the BRICS Countries. And our keynote speaker will be Professor Luca Belli, who is a full-time professor at FGV Rio Law and also the director of the Center for Technology and Society based at the same law school. He also coordinates the CyberBRICS project and works in the field of internet governance, data protection, and digital policies in BRICS. He has authored a innumerable amount of publications on internet regulation and digital policies, is also a board member of the Alliance for Affordable Internet, the director of the Latin American edition of the Computers Privacy and Data Protection Conference, and the editor of the International Privacy Data Law Journal by the Oxford University Press. And joining us today is also Smriti Parsheera as a discussant. She is a lawyer and a public policy researcher who focuses on issues at the intersection of technology and policy. She has had a great illustrious career spanning around 50 years in tech policy, where she also helped set up and lead the technology policy vertical at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy here in India. And she has also worked with CyberBRICS and the Competition Commission of India in the previous avatar. So that's it from my end for introductions. I would like to invite Professor Luca Belli to commence with this presentation.
Hello, good morning to everyone. Thank you very much, Shiva, for the very nice introduction. And thank you very much for having me for this final webinar of your tour de force around digital issues before the AI summit in India. Unfortunately, I will not be able to travel to India because of personal reasons, but I'm very much interested in understanding how discussions will unfold there in a couple of weeks. And I really hope that our research we have developed over the past 7 years on digital sovereignty, AI sovereignty, and other issues you will understand in the next 20 to 30 minutes intersect with this overarching issue and actually have allowed us to develop, I would say, our unique understanding of the matter, precisely based on the various mapping, particularly of areas of digital policies of the BRICS grouping and expanding grouping that we have developed over the past 7 years. Let me share quickly my presentation because I have prepared a slide deck so that you can have a little bit of references and have a better visual understanding of what we have been doing over the past years and why and how we ended up developing our understanding of digital sovereignty and AI sovereignty over the past years. So as was mentioned before, most of our research that I will present today stems from this research project called CyberBRICS. Is the only research project that currently exists in the world that analyzes and maps digital policies in various areas of the BRICS grouping, again, on expanding grouping. So we have focused over the past years a lot on data governance, then connectivity and digital transformation, and then, of course, over the past years, AI governance and industrial policy. This is a very important point. You will understand why in a couple of slides. But so this mappings and this evolving approach to various fields, extremely relevant fields, building blocks, if you want, of digital policies in the BRICS grouping, has allowed us to have a unique understanding of how these leading emerging economies are structuring and also implementing their digital strategies, and to what extent they are succeeding or failing. So we have not only a comparative approach, but we try to be critical in understanding what have been the ingredients of success, but also what sometimes have been the miserable failures of governments. And I think that that is the great privilege of academics, not only look at success, but also at failures. And again, we will see why in some slides. Now, let me also pay tribute to at least those who fit in a slide of our fellows over the past years, without whom this research would have not been possible. You will also recognize my discussant of today, Smriti Parsheera, a very good friend, a very smart woman that gave us the privilege of being here with us for 1 year, together with other researchers. More than 50% are women. They are from the entire BRICS region. That is very important because, again, I don't want to self-glorify our project too much, but it is really the only research project that does research on the BRICS with people from the BRICS, which is a very important ingredient of our strategy. And most of them might have a legal background, but they also have a mixed background in data science, economics, or social sciences. Now, this was the first, one of the first research outcomes we published in 2020. And already there, when we analyzed the cybersecurity strategies and regulations of the BRICS countries, we ended up understanding that there was a certain overlap with digital sovereignty. That was really very much the beginning of digital sovereignty discussions around the world. Ursula von der Leyen, European Union President of the Commission, in July 2020, when we published this volume, she declared that digital sovereignty and strategic autonomy were a priority for Europe. And we understood actually a little bit before, or maybe together with her, that actually there is an overlap, enormous overlap between cybersecurity and digital sovereignty. Cybersecurity is also a very strong pillar of our research here at the Center for Technology and Society at FGV. And cybersecurity is about understanding, analyzing digital systems and understanding where are the vulnerabilities. Digital sovereignty is about understanding digital systems, understanding where are the vulnerabilities, but also where are the opportunities, what you should develop to reduce your dependence. And that is precisely what we started understanding with this initial research 7 years ago, and what we have developed over the past years, right? Of course, cybersecurity and digital sovereignty are not synonyms, but they overlap. They overlap in what is the systemic study of technology to understand what could be the vulnerabilities, but also for digital sovereignty, what are the opportunities? And of course, if you invest in developing technology, this becomes very strategic also for cybersecurity. As we illustrate in this 2-volume, the green one has just been published last month. The blue one has been published 3 years ago, where we analyze cybersecurity in Brazil, and we stress the link with digital sovereignty. These are only available in Portuguese so far in the 2 websites for free. Most of our, I'm including advertisements for our publications, but most of our publications, if not all, are in open access. Those who are not in open access, you will find a preprint open access version in these 2 websites that you find here, the Center for Technology and Society website and the CyberBRICS project website. Now, when we started our debate on digital sovereignty, there was a first important question that is still quite ongoing in many research centers, which is, what is digital sovereignty? And so we had to elaborate our working definition that we applied to then develop this study that you find in open access also in the website of Cambridge University Press. This has been downloaded according to Cambridge own statistic more than 20,000 times over the past year. So a little bit of advertisement and a little bit also of pride because of the very high visibility it has had. This starts again with the question, what is digital sovereignty? So we define it as the capacity to understand, develop, and regulate digital technologies. And this is instrumental in order to enjoy self-determination, control, and power over technologies. And not being controlled through these technologies by external actors that have control on them, but being able, again, is very important, these three pillars: understanding the technology, how it functions, because only if you understand, you're able to develop it. And only if you understand and you develop it, you're able to regulate it effectively. That is what, unfortunately, our European friends have not understood. Well, they are understanding now that they find themselves, as most people in most countries, totally dependent on either US or Chinese technologies. Only if you develop an alternative, you may have choice, which is, in my perspective, what digital sovereignty is about. It's about having choice. It's about not being stuck in someone else's technology and not having the possibility to define what are the conditions according to which you use technology. This is something that I started to advocate 3 years ago in this paper during the G20 presidency of India, about building good digital sovereignty. Because there is, of course, we acknowledge perfectly well that there are very different nuances of digital sovereignty, spanning from the authoritarian and the protectionistic until a very good notion, which is empowering people through technology and fostering competition through development, which is the good digital sovereignty that I think we should strive to promote. So understanding the technology, to developing it, to empower people, to give more opportunities for businesses, to build technology that respects your law of the land and does not respect only the terms of service and the algorithmic governance and technology set by other foreign corporations in other countries that you frequently use this to extract value. So in this paper, I analyzed how India and Brazil were fostering good examples of digital sovereignty through DPIs like the UPI in India and the PICs in Brazil, also stressing the differences, the fact that I think UPI has been a trailblazer, but of course could be improved because it is public, because it is publicly accessible, but it's not public because it is run by a public entity, as our PICS system that very much takes inspiration from the UPI, but is run by the Brazilian Central Bank. It means that it is truly public. It means that if I file a freedom of access to information request, the Brazilian Central Bank has to tell me which data they have on me, which kind of cybersecurity systems they utilize. If I file this in India about UPI, well, our Indian friend will know very well that the National Payment Corporation of India can reply, well, we are not a public institution, so we do not have to abide to freedom to access to information law, which is a very strong difference, right? And also very few people know that actually both Brazil and India took inspiration in developing this DPI from Russia. Russia is the first country that developed an alternative to Visa and MasterCard that, of course, have a duopoly in the rest of the world and extract not only 3 to 5% of every transaction, so a very relevant sum of money for every type of transaction, but they also centralize data collection. And that is something that very few people understand. Visa and MasterCard, they don't only have a duopoly on payments and the fees that come with the payment, they have a duopoly in most of the world on data collection and the enormous amount of money and intelligence that you can extract from it. The 3 to 5% is an ancillary payment. The most of the money that Visa and MasterCard do is because of the data. And India, well, first, Russia because it was sanctioned with the impossibility to use Visa and MasterCard. And so overnight, they had to develop the system MIR, like the space station. It's called MIR, but it was still a card system. So based on cards, like Visa and MasterCard. The great invention of the Indians has been to make it software made. And I think the great improvement of Brazil has been to make it truly a public service, right? There are still, of course, a lot of things that can be improved, both in India and Brazil. But let's give to Caesar what is all to Caesar. They have done an enormous step forward toward digital sovereignty with this. Another point that I analyze in the paper, which is also analyzed in other publication, is how also community networks, so community-based internet connectivity infrastructure are very good example of digital sovereignty, because that is a very good example of how digital sovereignty can be built in a crowdsourced, bottom-up fashion. Does not have to be only a state-led set of initiatives, can be driven by local communities for the benefits of the local communities according to their own rules and values of the local communities and keeping value in the local communities. There are thousands of examples of community networks built in India, in Brazil, in other BRICS countries like South Africa, where local communities understand how connectivity works, they develop their own infrastructure, and they rule it according to their own values. This is a fantastic example and underexplored one of how digital sovereignty can be a crowdsourced initiative. Now, also to have a little bit of objective vision on digital sovereignty and how it links to digital public infrastructure. Of course, digital public infrastructures are not only beautiful advancements that empower people. They might be also some authoritarian connotations of it, and they may be, and they have to be actually improved to be more accountable. There are some very good publications that our Indian and Brazilian colleagues have done on this. Here I have a very good article that my discussant Smriti published in our special issue on digital transformation about Stack is the New Black, where it criticizes the Indian approach in a very constructive fashion. I would say another good comparison between Brazil and India of how DPI can be used or cannot be used for AI purposes in our latest special issue on AI sovereignty in the BRICS. I encourage everyone to freely download this. And of course, this very much connects with our discussion on data sovereignty and the fact that data governance must include not only regulation on data protection, which is necessary, but not sufficient by itself. As countless examples demonstrate, having a nice law and building a nice authority gives you a nice facade that makes you resemble the European Union, but don't necessarily allow you to understand how data hoovering works, how to develop an alternative, and how to effectively regulate how data governance works, right? This is something that we stress with very telling examples from the BRICS regions. And I would like to just to stress a couple of important points here that will be useful for the next step of my presentation. I will speak about AI sovereignty. First, you have to understand how data-intensive technologies work, including AI, whose main component, one of the main components at least, is data. So you have to understand how the technology works and what are the enablers of the technology. Otherwise, the regulation is useless. What is the enabler of the data economy? And then you have to bet also on industrial policy, on facilitating the development of the technology and the research that allows you to understand the development of technology, also to make the regulation effective. Right? So if you only regulate with sanctions, which is the main tool of regulation of the law, you fail to regulate. You also have to regulate with facilitation, with industrial policy, which is another extremely understudied tool of regulation, facilitative regulation, which is what our Chinese friends teach us. They have been doing this for more than 20 years with regard to digital matters. This is also a paper published 4 years ago also in open access for the Indian Journal of Law and Technology. I compared how Brazil, China, and India at the time were shaping their digital governance, and why all they copy and paste to some extent to European regulation. They all have their secret ingredients. Brazil has a very strong multi-stakeholder component, which is, in my opinion, very enormously underdeveloped and underexploited, because it could be much better exploited to implement the regulation and not only to develop nice reports that are not necessarily the most read or the most effective. China blends regulation with industrial policy in a very skillful way. And that is how they developed a multi-trillion data industry over the past 20 years with industrial policy. And India has understood very well that you have to leverage your national skills to make it a competitive advantage. And so use the development of software as a competitive advantage. See how not only the DPI example related to the UPI, but also DEPA, which is a very important and very understudied element of Indian data governance, the data empowerment and protection architecture, software that allows you to control data. Now, the very relevant, let's say, innovation of China that I believe people are realizing is not that anodyne, is that they, since 2019, consider officially data as a factor of production. Together with capital, labor, land, information is a factor of production. And therefore, they shape their industrial policies, their national policies in this belief. Let's leverage an enormous wealth that we have in China, especially with 1.5 billion people, a little less than India in this moment, which is an enormous advantage. If data is the new oil, if personal data is the most valuable asset in the world, you are a little bit stupid if you are not leveraging it, which is what most other countries have been doing over the past 20 years, declaring that data was the new oil, but then adopting policies that don't allow them to leverage this enormous wealth, which is what China has been doing and what India has been doing, I think, in a smarter way over the past 15 years at least. This is something that we started analyze 4 or 5 years ago with my colleague and friend Danilo Doneda. Unfortunately, he passed away. I always mention this also to pay homage to him. This is the last paper we published together before he passed away, and to him we have dedicated the book that has just been published by Oxford University Press, and I just received this morning when I arrived at my office. This book unfortunately is not in open access on the OUP website, but a preprint version of all the chapters, and also including annexes with the English versions of all the laws of the BRICS countries is in open access on cyberbrics.info. So if you want to have free knowledge about how BRICS are shaping their data governance policies, you are very welcome to freely download it. Our research actually has been quite influential at the BRICS level. I'm telling this because we have been, as you were seeing in the previous slide, we have been working on interoperability in data policies at the BRICS level quite a few years ago. And it was very interesting when in 2024, as an outcome of the Kazan summit, the BRICS leaders agreed for the first time to explicitly mention that they wanted to work on a global framework for data governance, including cross-border data flows, and that this global framework must ensure the interoperability of data policy framework at all levels. It was the first time that the BRICS leaders mentioned this in a statement. Of course, we had a very good discussions and cooperation over the past years with our friends at Itamayachi which is the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with whom we have very frequent discussions. We share our research because they know that it's quite useful. It has been very inspirational, I think, for the last summit of the BRICS leader here in Rio de Janeiro. It happened in July. The overarching goal was to strengthen cooperation for a more inclusive and sustainable governance, led by Global South leaders, or at least with an increased participation of Global South leaders. Now, I just wanted to mention this very important document that has not received, I think, the attention it should internationally, this BRICS Data Economy Governance Understanding, that includes a lot of the ideas that you will find developed in this book. Of course, in a short statement, high-level statement, can risk to be superficial, but I think it's an enormous step in the direction of developing what I think could be, in some years, a proposal on data governance led by the BRICS countries. We have seen, I think very few people would have bet that the idea of a cybercrime convention proposed by the BRICS would have ever been an international treaty. 5 or 6 years ago, I was amongst that people. I think it would have been very difficult to have this concrete in a treaty. How things change, right, internationally and geopolitically. I think that BRICS have taken advantage very well of the vacuum that has been left, especially by the US over the past years. What was initially a proposal of a cybercrime convention led by China and Russia, especially since 2011, became a treaty last year, signed by more than 70 countries already this year. So I would bet that a global governance understanding led by BRICS will be presented in the upcoming years, and I would bet that these have serious chances of becoming an UN treaty. But then we will see in the future if I will be right or not. If you want to know more, I suggest you read the conclusion of the book, again in free access, where we discuss also how to create model contractual provision to make this easier than adopting a treaty. We also sketch some normative and operational principles distilled from the BRICS experience that could be useful. Some of them are classic normative principles on data protection. Others are more interesting, I would say, operational principles adopted by the BRICS, like effective, well, not always effective, but, well, effective always, not necessarily independent, but always frequently effective oversight, secure data transfer, privacy by design, promotion of pets through privacy-enhancing technologies like the data, and facilitative regulation, as I was mentioning before, I think is an essential ingredient. I will not enter into the details of the model contractual clauses, and I will use, because you can read them and they're quite long, but I will use in the last 5 minutes to get to one of the main topics we have been working with the past 5 years, which is what is AI sovereignty and how this builds upon the research we have developed over the past years, and I've tried to synthesize over the past 20 minutes. So based on the working definition I was mentioning before of digital sovereignty, this is the definition that we have used to analyze AI sovereignty in the BRICS. Our volume with the detailed analysis will be published in the next semester by Routledge. The special issue with some analysis has already been published by the African Journal of Information Technology I was mentioning before. Our definition is very much built on what I was mentioning before. So the capacity to understand, develop, and regulate AI systems, thus retaining self-determination, agency, and control over such systems. I would like to stress the develop part, because this definition may be very similar to other definitions. And again, of course, we have, through our desk review, we have seen other works of other scholars, but very few of them focus on the development part, which is the most important, I would say, not only for developing countries, but for everyone. This was first presented at the Carnegie Endowment Conference, two actually conferences in 2023, one in Argentina and one in India, promoted by Carnegie India, together with the Indian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This has been quite well received, also because the key message is that there are two key messages, actually. One, that risk-based regulation is necessary, but not sufficient. And I think this is something at this point everyone can agree with, but at the time was sort of unorthodox to say that the EU AI Act was, of course, necessary to deal with risks, but very, very useless if you are not able to develop your own alternative to risky technologies. This was presented at the IGF also in 2023. The updated version of the book, I've just received it actually this morning when I arrived at the office together with the other book. And you can find the open access version of it on cyberbrics.info. The second very important point of the book, which is the framework we have been using for our analysis over the past couple of years, is that if you want to study a system, you need a systemic approach. And if you only look at risk-based regulation, you will fail, because that is only part of the system, right? So what I designed some 3 years ago is this matrix of key AI sovereignty enablers. You will see at the bottom that there is risk-based regulation. It's essential, but not sufficient. Of course, as you might have seen, if you might have understood from the previous presentation, data governance is essential, not only personal data. Software, algorithms and models is essential. Again, developing them, studying them, and regulating them. Computational capacity, I think that few people now would object this. Meaningful connectivity is a highly understudied enabler. I would mention this with a reality check about Brazil in a couple of minutes. And India has to be acknowledged for the enormous work they did with the net neutrality regulation in 2016, 10 years ago exactly, prohibited zero rating models. Of course, there are a lot of things that can be criticized of India, but this is the greatest untold success story of Indian digital sovereignty. Prohibition of zero rating and promotion of net neutrality so that everyone can not only use, but also share whatever technology they want, and boost what has been a belle epoque of Indian creativity over the past 10 years that led to development of Indian tech giants. So that is a very important point that is still missing in Brazil, and I will speak about this in the next two slides. Electrical power and natural resources. Again, at this point, I think it is clear for everyone, was very, very understudied 3 years ago, and still very ununderstood to date. Brazil has an enormous asset in here. Few people know that Brazil has more than 80% of its electrical matrix come from renewables, fruit of decades of industrial policy that develop hydroelectric power, wind energy, solar energy, but especially hydroelectric power, thanks to which now we attract investment in computational capacity because there is abundance of electricity and it's cheap. What has completely finished in the US that has no energy anymore to build data centers. Digital literacy, what we can even call humanware. So the development of capacity so that people are not only consumers, they are producers of technology and they understand the risk, which of course is essential for cybersecurity reasons. Again, technology have a lot of opportunity to offer, but an enormous amount of risk also. And if you don't understand them, well, you are building a time bomb. Risk-based regulation, I think this has been discussed by many of my colleagues for many years, so I will not enter into this. But of course, again, let me reiterate, is essential, but not sufficient. Now, let me conclude to illustrate this with a quick reality check on Brazil. because thanks to our work, also AI sovereignty entered in the official AI plan that was heralded by President Lula at the G20 organized by Brazil 2 years ago. I was very happy to see this, but I was a little bit unhappy to see how this in practice work, which is something, full disclosure, I have included in my in the paper I've just sent for the Brazilian Ministry of Science and Technology, that tries to sketch a vision for the Brazilian government of digital sovereignty. The lack of meaningful connectivity that I was mentioning before is an important key AI sovereignty enabler, threatens all other investments in computational capacity and algorithmic capacity that the Brazilian government is putting forward. If you have 78% of the population that does not have meaningful connectivity, as CETIC has very tellingly illustrated 2 years ago, it means that almost 80% of the population will never be able to access the enormous inventions and technologies you are developing with all that billions and all that computational capacity, because most of them will be only stuck in what is zero-rated, that coincidentally in Brazil is mostly Meta family of applications. That is how looks AI for the poorest portion of the population in Brazil, which as in any country is the majority of the population, and in any global south country is the overwhelming majority of the population. So if most of your people is poor, you cannot allow zero rating to be state policy of connectivity, because otherwise you concentrate attention and capacity to share innovation only in what is zero rating, which coincidentally, up until the beginning of last year in Brazil was only Meta family of app. To illustrate my point, let me share you how now Perplexity and ChatGPT are entering the market, zero rating themselves their own services, because they've understood that this is the only way you can compete in Brazil, as in any country that allows zero rating to be a connectivity policy. If you do not look why I'm sharing this, not only because this is something that honestly, together with a lot of other colleagues and friends, I've been warning governments for at least a decade. And it is not just for the pleasure of telling to governments, I told you, but it is for the very important reason that I was mentioning before. If you look at the digital system or AI system, you have to look systemically. Otherwise, if you forget a part of the system, they are all equally important. If you forget it, it will be used as a vulnerability to hijack the entire system. Thank you very much for your attention, and sorry if I spoke 3 minutes more than what was allowed to me. Thank you very much. Very open to debate.
Thank you, Luca. That was a lot of information in a positive sense. I actually really appreciate how you traced it from way back from the beginning of sort of where you started researching about digital sovereignty, and then you thread it through to what it is now. And also you bring in all these related aspects of how these data markets also play a role. And yeah, so I think with this, I'd like to ask Smriti for her discussant remarks. And after that, we can have a small, time permitting, we can have a small sort of back and forth on like a debate, like Luca said, he's open for this debate. Thank you, Smriti.
Sure. Thank you so much. Let me start by thanking the ICRIER team for having me here and for having this, series of conversation because we hear so much about deployment of AI, but to really ground it in conversations about, ethics and responsible development, I think that's really important prelude to the summit. So kudos to all of you for organizing that. Always a delight to hear, Luca. Thank you for that excellent presentation where you managed to capture really so many years of work within half an hour. And it really came out from the 2 books that you showed, especially that there's so much happening in this space. And of course, as a former member of the project, I only have great things to say and to commend the project and, what Luca's leadership for showing, turning the dominant lens of understanding digital governance, which is usually from the US and Eurocentric perspective, from reversing that lens to, a BRICS perspective. It takes a lot because we are studying very complex countries which are very dissimilar, right? They're not really united by an economic or moral philosophy. So they're different countries on their own trajectories, but there are some lessons that can be learned. There are critiques where lessons can be learned out of the critiques, not just out of the good things that are happening. And I think the project and Luca have done really great work in bringing all of that together. I think in the next couple of years would be very interested to see how the project expands in terms of the new additions to the BRICS, membership, how that actually really complicates with the addition of Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and how the dynamics change and how the digital, policies in those countries will affect some of the trends that you're seeing. So very keen to follow that work and see where that goes. So really, Luca has given us the big picture of the trends in the BRICS countries. I am going to try and build on some of that, but also relocate that to my research, which of course is more India-centric. So just as a broad overview, I want to talk about two broad points. One is on the concept of sovereignty itself, including engaging with how Luca has defined it in his work. And the second is localizing it to the Indian context, looking at some of the lessons from other digital governance scenarios and how they intersect with the AI governance debate. So, examples from the intermediary regulation space or data governance space, and how that intersects with what we can anticipate in terms of AI sovereignty debates in India. And I'm building on a lot of this in terms of the work, some of which Luca has already referred to from the CyberBRICS project, but also a forthcoming book project where I look at a chapter on ICT governance trajectory in India, looking at it from the lens of the digital citizen, so not from the state or the private enterprise, but reversing the lens again and looking at these questions from the perspective of the citizen. So to start with, on sovereignty as a concept, I think Luca has done a great job of trying to define it both as digital sovereignty and in the context of AI sovereignty. And I think the sovereignty conversation in the BRICS context is really particularly interesting because the concept of sovereignty itself has such a Eurocentric origin, right? Going back to the context of the Westphalian sovereignty idea, the idea of absolute supremacy over a particular territory, right? So that's where, and that became the norm in international law. But we have seen how that thinking has evolved over the many years, certainly in the context of digital debates, but even before that, right? When you look back to the idea of sovereignty in the context of social contract. And I want to talk a little bit about that because I think it's very important to translate that into the digital context. So look at Locke and Rousseau, like that kind of thinking of philosophers, where they say that it's the individuals who are the residents, of who control power, and it is they who, through social contract, transfer that onto the state or onto another authority, and that authority then must preserve life, liberty, and property for this group of individuals, right? And that, I think, connects well with the digital sovereignty debate, where Luca has given us this framing of sovereignty, where it is about, of course, how sovereignty is operationalized, questions of, he talks about self-determination, agency, power, control. But there's also this other question, which I found this interesting 2024 paper by Hu Roberts, who questions it from a normative lens, right? So not how sovereignty is operationalized, but also what is the basis, the legitimacy of how sovereignty is acquired, right? So instead of looking at sovereignty as a form of control, to look at it as well. This is an interesting link back to the social contract. It is useful to think about, does this in terms of, having citizens as the initial actor who is supposed to be the resident of the power, and then link it to the, the lens of the digital citizen on whether there are mechanisms of participation in digital governance processes, and what are the mechanisms for assessing outcomes, again, from a citizen-centric perspective. We could say that there is, sovereign power is being asserted, or there is, economic power being acquired, but how does that translate into the everyday life of the citizen? I think that is also a burden that we must bear when we think about digital sovereignty, and be able to justify and explain, some of that in tangible terms, what that means. Now, turning to some of the examples from the local context in India, I said there are a couple of, examples. I think intermediary regulation stands out. It is a topic in the last couple of years has been very dominant in the governance debates in India. most recently connecting very closely also with AI regulation debates, right? When we think about things like Grok using, putting up sexualized imagery, and what are the tools that we have in our regulatory toolkit to handle that, it boils down to questions around intermediary regulation and the new rules that were imposed by the government in 2021. And this, of course, connects with the global momentum towards recognizing the gravity of online harms and the need to address some of that. But of course, also the geopolitical context of this, that there are states like India which are grappling with these questions, but there are providers and platforms which are usually not, at least the dominant ones, are not based out of India. So, when you talk about the ability to enforce terms on them or the ability to demand terms on them, they are bound also by the laws of their home jurisdictions, which limits access for law enforcement, etc. in India. So that's really the legitimate context in which this debate has come out. But of course, in the manner of enforcement, you also find that in the in the need for demanding accountability from businesses, often the way sovereignty ends up being exercised is in a way which is detrimental to the citizen, because it can have adverse impacts on free speech. And we've seen that in the series of challenges that have come up against these rules. A lot of them are still going on, about the overreaching nature of such rules, about the violation of the bounds of what is permissible legislation, what is delegated legislation, what must be done by the parliament, what the government can do on its own. So these are really fundamental questions which go down to the question of, how is sovereignty operationalized, and which agency within the government is the appropriate agency to do that. I think I already hinted at questions of cross-border flows. That's again been a very, very contentious topic for us in the Indian context, and including in the context of the Data Protection Act. And finally, where we've landed up in the act itself is that, in terms of the private personal data, it seems like it's a fairly liberal regime where, anything which is not restricted specifically, those countries are, all data flows are permitted. But of course, it is to be recognized that this comes in the context where we've reserved space for sector-specific data localization or data cross-border restrictions to come about. And that again will point back to this question about, what are the metrics on which, when someone imposes these restrictions, are we thinking about the civil liberties implications of that? Are we bound, are any agencies bound to think about, what will happen to localized data? What will happen if law enforcement access to that is very easy in a context where we don't have strong surveillance related protections? I think those are again questions which again go back to, because in the cross-border data debate, including going back to the Justice Sri Krishna Committee report, we did see AI come up as an important factor, saying that for the development of AI, we want data to be localized and located within the country. And of course, this is a bit of a tenuous link, because it's not really shown how just having the data on data centers within your country, you would have better AI systems. But of course, it is a narrative which has picked up. And but just to come back to the question around digital citizens, I think the point there is that we need to be thinking about, when we think about a certain sovereignty over data, or as Luca said, rightly leveraging data, we also need to think about what this means for outcomes for the end consumer. And the DPI debate, I think Luca has explained it very well and has spoken both about the promise as well as the challenges. So I don't want to go deeper in that, but just except to make the point that we've observed where the DPI is not just something which is part of the domestic sovereignty narrative in India. It's also become a very important part of the the diplomacy that India is engaging in, the global diplomacy. And there again, it raises these questions around accountability, etc., which Luca said I've talked about in some of the previous work. One of the point which I do want to emphasize is that a lot of the question around having domestic infrastructures has come up in the context of this foreign versus domestic industry question. And there it is important to recognize that if we create large infrastructures which are backed by the state, supported by the state, we need to be cognizant whether we are creating those same patterns of power and abuse of power, the possibility of gatekeeping by certain actors, the possibility of exclusion of actors who don't fit into a particular framework, etc. So whether lock-ins can be generated. I think we need to think about all those questions. I frame this as the possibility of creating alt big tech, and it is a provocative term, but something we need to think about as we do a pro-sovereignty kind of narrative in favor of building DPIs. Now, I just want to quickly jump to the context of AI governance, and there, of course, we've seen the call that seems to have been taken so far from the establishment management is to not pursue AI regulation. So we've talked about AI principles, we have policy documents, but we are not really thinking about an EU-like AI regulatory position. But what we do have is things like the India AI mission, which is doing great work in terms of building some of the core components of how AI is to be operationalized. So compute capabilities, availability of data sets, foundational models, these are funding for startups. These are the kind of priorities and the correct priorities which the mission has adopted. But I think it's also important to think about when we say we adopt certain principles, and these including the AI mission talks about certain core principles of safety, security, fairness, etc. I think in the Indian context we do need to think carefully about what does it mean. For instance, when we say transparency, does it include transparency for the non-profit owning and owner entities of DPS? Does it extend to transparency to those entities? Or when we talk about fairness and bias, what does that look like in the Indian context? And there's great work in India which has talked about the fact that you can't look at a Western-centric lens of what fairness or bias means, which is very often race-centric or very often focuses on gender. Whereas we have very different, or in addition, we have additional, lenses of bias in India, and we need to think about questions like caste, religion, ethnicity. So it has to be a very localized understanding of what each of these principles means. And I think that's important to the AI governance debate in India. I just want to add right at the end a paper that I had worked on with Gaurav Jain a couple of years back now, where we created a data set of Indian faces, and we studied the question of what is the performance of commercially available facial recognition tools on Indian faces. How well do they perform? Do they recognize faces? Do they correctly classify the gender of these faces? This was replicating the very foundational work, gender studies paper done by Joy Bulumarani and Tim Nigab. And what we found here, of course, we did find that, as these systems do, they perform worse on women as compared to men. That was an expected finding. But the part I want to talk a little bit about is, the dealing of the data set that was created in this paper and the challenges that we encountered with that. First, we know very well that there is a dearth of Indian data sets out there. And we found that in this paper also, that when we wanted to do studies on Indian faces, we found that we don't really have representative data set. So we have celebrity faces data set, or you might have some created by university students, small pools, which are not really representative of the diversity of India. So what we opted for in this paper was to create our own data set out of images from the Election Commission of India's website. But this, again, we were in really tricky domain, right? On one hand, we are creating a data set out of publicly available images, which many people would tell us is totally kosher and it's totally fine. But we also know that there is a contextual integrity when people give their data set, their images for a particular purpose. We need to exercise caution on how that gets translated for other purposes. So we did worry a lot about that, and we took some precautions in this paper. Like, we didn't put out any personal identifier information into the paper. We didn't release the whole data set because you don't know what kind of purposes it could be modified and used for in future. We did data minimization, so we only took the attributes which were necessary for our research. But the point I want to make here is that even in the absence of a regulatory framework, which we seem some distance away from in India, there is the need or a possibility of self-regulation by researchers, by developers, by everyone in this AI governance ecosystem, both in terms of how we apply some of this in applied work kind of this, but also, the normative thinking around what would it mean to be fair in Indian context, what would it mean to be accountable in the Indian context. And I think that's the stage at which all of us are as a community right now, and where we need to be going. So I just want to, end with the re-emphasis on the question of legitimacy in the definition of digital sovereignty, and how when we attribute sovereignty to multiple actors, starting from the individual, the community, the business, to the state, we need to think about at each level, where is the legitimacy deriving from, and how is that rooted in the principles of participation, transparency, and accountability, which is possible at each of these levels. So thank you.
Thank you, Smriti. That was very insightful. Actually, really captured the whole breadth of the conversation from all the way from the data governance law, like DPDP, data protection, data governance, to what we should be looking at, what we can explore, already things that are already regulatory instruments or instruments that are already being used, maybe not exactly for AI governance, but for data governance, and how we can sort of translate those and like translate those and what works better, and then also newer questions that we need to ask ourselves when we talk about governing these new technologies, which have become sort of omniscient in today's time, whether we like it or not. So I'd like to first ask whether the panelists have any questions or comments for each other. Otherwise, I have a question I'd like to pose to the both of you. No?
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. It's a bit of a general heavyweight question, but because we talked about through this entire journey, we traced the sort of journey of from data governance to AI, digital sovereignty to AI sovereignty, and we weaved in the governance frameworks from technology governance to internet governance to data governance and now to AI governance. And when we focus on the BRICS countries, we also know that the Brussels effect is what's a lot more popular or what's a lot more prevalent. So keeping that in mind, with this AI Impact Summit, which is happening here, although it's a bit impact focused, but I would like to believe that we will talk some governance and policy at the summit this time. Keeping that in mind, and also the upcoming BRICS presidency of India, do you think there is a way that sort of these places can be leveraged for better South-South or global cooperation or South-South cooperation, which is something that both these events do tend to focus on, and AI governance is also, and at least AI is something that they are also focusing on. I know it's a very generic question, but if you have any comments on that, because we do want to sort of explore ways where these events can be used to further these conversations.
Luca, do you want to start?
Yeah, if I can chip in. So something that's actually has been quite relevant for our understanding of digital policies, and it is a direct observation of the BRICS policy making and policy implementation over the past years, as I was mentioning before, is that one has to really connect this theoretical ideal, at least what it looks like a theoretical idea, that data is the new oil, that data has value, with empirical approaches to it. And why I am saying this? Because the Brussels effect that you were mentioning, which is a very catchy term, but has enormous limitation, as the very author, Anu Bradford, acknowledges. I think, again, I have nothing against this. I think it's useful to take inspiration from what has worked and for what also has not worked from other experiences, right? And I think that Europe has 50 years of experience in designing personal data laws. So it is an example that must be studied. But as any other thing, must be studied in an objective fashion and not advertised with proselytism, as sometimes maybe some European friends used to do, because it has limits. And enormous limits that the European model has shown is that it has failed to frame how to encourage the use of data in a sustainable way and in a collective way. Why am I stressing this? Because I think that this very important point we make in our data sovereignty paper. We have all the personal data frameworks that we have developed over the past 60 years. They start from the conception of what is called informational self-determination, so the capacity of the individual to control how his or her personal data are used. And all the data protection framework have been built on this individualistic perspective, which is essential, but again, is not sufficient. It has limits. It relies on the individual knowing that he or she has right, being able and having the time to petition authorities to regulate any kind of abuse of his or her rights, and the authority having the political capacity. Well, first, the intellectual capacity to understand how extremely complicated systems work, and second, the political capacity to rule and not to fear being the authority that is pointed as the authority that stifles innovation when it says this is patently illegal. This is against hoovering personal data of everyone to train your model is patently in contrast with informational self-determination. You have to have another way of doing this, and maybe it will take you 3 years more, but it will be legal. If you do it now, you will be the first in the market, but it will be illegal. That is a trivial example of that illustrates the limits of our conception of informational self-determination, which is the basis of the Brussels effect, which is the reason why our data protection systems are very ineffective. What has been, I think, understood by China and to some extent by India and by an increasing amount of countries, well, and by the US in a different way 50 years ago, is this data exactly is a factor of production. And which means that, well, either in a very US perspective, you delegate the extraction of it and the regulation, the technological regulation of it through algorithmical means to your own digital champions, and as the US have been doing for 50 years, or you have to invest in having to decentralize this capacity for the national interest, which can be, as the Chinese consider, the interest that is set by the Chinese Communist Party, but does not have necessarily to be either the interest set by a unique party or the interest set by a handful of corporations. To understand how to define this and promote a system that distributes this wealth and empowers people, you have first to understand how it works, which I think is what we are starting to do in most countries after years of bragging about the Brussels effect. So I think that the Brussels effect has limits. I think that, again, I'm not against data protection law. On the contrary, I've spent the past 10 years teaching it, but exactly because I've spent a little bit of time studying it, I know it has a lot of limits. And if you just praise it for the sake of having a law and a nice authority, that actually, this could be my question to you. Every time I meet Smriti at a webinar or around the world at conferences, I ask her if the Data Protection Board of India has finally been created or not. She frequently tells me that it hasn't. So this is actually a very genuine curiosity to understand if finally the Data Protection Board of India has been created or not. But again, this is very tellingly also in the Indian experience, the fact that it will not be a regulator in the sense of a standard setting body, but a regulator in the sense that can regulate only to fine someone when an abuse has been practiced, and someone has to know that they have this right, go there when it will be created. I'm not sure it has been created yet, and maybe after 5 or 6 years, some petty sanction will be adopted. This is a totally ineffective system, and I think we have to change our mindset if we want to be effective.
I'll just add to that, saying that I think past experience shows that India has used its presidencies in a kind of strategic way. So we've seen this with the, 2023 G20 presidency in particular, where DPI was brought into the, international lexicon post that event. So in that sense, and even with the, the questions around cross-border data flows, the Osaka track, and India refraining to sign on to that, and maintaining that you don't want, the country doesn't want absolute free flow of data, wants to retain space for utilizing the term is for data for development, which can be constrained if you continue with the status quo. So I think at various junctures there has been a strategic position that India has taken. Given the trends that we are seeing, I would imagine that what we are going to continue seeing is this focus on the techno-legal solution approach, which is the DPI model, the DPI for AI. I expect that to continue. I think as a researcher community, given that is the status quo and given that is where the trend is going to be, I think our contribution would be to try to bring more nuance, given, this is the starting point. what can be done in order to, you know, not just position this tactically, strategically, geopolitically, but from a, you know, citizen perspective, which is what I've been trying to say. What does it take for the same infrastructure like DAPA, etc., for instead of it just becoming, you know, a consent management mechanism which helps businesses by recording that yes, we did take consent and we have legitimate proof to show that, what is the ways in which that can, you know, genuinely help consumers in a way that removes some of the structural barriers to consent, which will remain despite having, you know, an electronic mechanism will not change some of that. So what are those next steps that need to be taken to still work within the bounds of these techno-legal solutions, but be more empowering to users?
Great. Thank you both. That was a lot of food for thought for as a conclusion for this webinar. And okay, I think Professor Malik has to leave. And with that note, I'd also like to conclude this webinar and also add that we will be putting out like a small, I don't want to call it like a synthesis of the discussions we've had during this webinar, this and all the others in this series. Before the summit, we'll be releasing that. So I think this this ending was also a good way for us, food for thought for us, to sort of see how and suggest how we can leverage this opportunity as India and India's presidency into something sort of forwarding these conversations and bringing, as Smriti said, more nuance to these regulations and these instruments that are already sort of the status quo, for a lack of a better word. And thank you so much. Thank you for your time, Smriti. And thank you, Luca, your first major commitment after a big holiday. Really appreciate it. And that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you very much for the invitation. Bye-bye.
Bye.